I have a question for you. Have you ever experienced trouble falling asleep? All right, it's not a fair question because I knew the answer. Of course, we all have experienced trouble falling asleep. And I'm sure if I ask you for some remedies of what you've done to actually do fall asleep, you'll give me a handful of useful things that you have probably done. And I'm going to venture a guess that at some point you were probably told by someone, oh, if you can't fall asleep, it's very easy, just count sheep. Have you been told that before?
Yeah.
So I just imagine the vast flock and just look at how many there are and just go one by one and just count head by head by head. And before you know, of course, you'll fall asleep. So the advice is solid. It worked for many people before. And it actually does work. Why? Because you drift off to sleep because your mind is able to focus on something mundane. Whatever it is that's troubling you, that's not letting you sleep, you're able to let it go because you're too busy counting sheep, which is something very mundane and not super important in your mind at that moment, which is why, as you let go of those other thoughts, the sleep takes over and you drift off. So actually quite a good remedy, very practical one, and it does work. So, in our weekly reading what we have Pharaoh not counting sheep, but instead he is really disturbed by the dreams in which he encounters cows and stalks of grain, and he counts them. And he doesn't have to go very high up. But he is disturbed by these dreams. The dreams are just troubling him. He knew there was something important. He didn't know what it was. And he couldn't make sense of the message that they carried. Sometimes our dreams carry messages, sometimes they don't. But he realized that he himself did not have the answers. So in Genesis chapter 41, verse 8, we read that he turned to the experts. Okay, he turns to his sages, to the men of his court, to the wise men, and they weren't able to help him either. So this is a familiar problem. We can all easily identify with Pharaoh. Sometimes when we're stuck and we turn to the experts, they disappoint us. They don't actually have the answers for us. And sometimes we turn to God too, and we seek to hear from God, but no answers come. That happens too. Familiar problem. But that is not the end of the story, not in Bereshit as we read. In Genesis 41, verse 9, unexpectedly, all of a sudden, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer made a confession. And this is what he says. He says, Et chatatai ani maktir chayom. Today I remember my transgressions. And it's like, I remembered today out of all days. Now, what did he mean by this? Well, the truth is that the story tells us that in jail, his dream that he told to a young Jewish boy or young man at that moment, he was able to interpret this dream. And everything that this man has foretold happened exactly as it happened. And before his dream was interpreted, there was only one thing that Joseph asked for him, is that when he actually makes it out of that jailhouse, that he remembers him and puts in a good word in his court. Perhaps with Pharaoh, it doesn't even have to go with Pharaoh, but somebody out there is going to care. So, but he forgot. He forgot. And right now, at this moment, when the king is stuck in this difficult situation, his chief cupbearer remembers that he knows somebody. Oh, I know somebody who could help you in exactly the same way. So he says, today I remember my transgressions. Meaning that he failed on his promise. You see, a path to solution often reveals itself when we and others around us recognize our mistakes and try to correct them. You see, what if the cupbearer did not think of that? The king probably would have never found out what his dream meant. But he recognized his shortcoming. He confessed it. He said, I know someone. I messed up. I should have done this earlier. Now, Pharaoh listened to his cupbearer. That's also important. And he had Joseph brought to him from the jailhouse. So the story tells us. And indeed, Joseph was able to help Pharaoh with understanding his dream. The solution to King's problem came from a very unlikely source. And sometimes, my friends, you and I, we become, closed-minded in our search for answers. We look to the obvious places, right? We try it ourselves, we turn to the experts, we look to God, and then we're like, okay, I've exhausted my list of options. That's it. Sometimes we limit God in the way in which He can speak to us. So we think God is not answering sometimes. But in reality, He is answering. We're just not able to hear because we're not looking for the answer in the right places. So in this story, as I read it, the Pharaoh's behavior and all the things that are being described, they really have some valuable lessons for us to learn. So here are a couple thoughts that came to my mind that I think can help us in our daily lives. Point number one is this. Answers from God come a lot of times when experts disappoint us. And we get challenged by different things in life. No doubt about that. I don't know, maybe it's your family relationships. Those get complicated. Maybe it's your job and relationship with your coworkers. Relationships are probably one of the biggest areas where we get troubled. Each of us, we face challenges, whatever those challenges may be. And usually those challenges are unique to us. The obstacles that we have, they have something to do with us. A lot of times they have something to do with our character, believe it or not, because God is involved and He knows exactly what He's doing. He's just helping you to work out these challenges so you can grow through this. And we, as we go through these challenges, need to recognize the areas in which we need to grow. Many of us know those areas. We know where we struggle. And those challenges are simply opportunities to become the kind of people that Hashem wants us to be. Now, I am no longer speaking about dreams anymore, if you haven't figured this out yet. The dreams that Pharaoh dreamed, consider them to be examples of the things that you and I cannot unravel or overcome on our own. There are things in our lives that we simply cannot deal with on our own. We need someone else's help. We are stuck. We all have those things. Now, we're generally competent, I believe. Most of us, we're able to solve a lot of problems. We have skills, we have knowledge, we know who to go, who to access when we get stuck. Like I said, we turn to the experts. That's really smart. That's really wise. I mean, we turn to the people who know best, who know better than we do. And the natural course of things is usually like that. And yes, many of us are spiritual people, and we turn to Hashem as well. We speak to Hashem. We ask Him. Unlike Pharaoh, some of us begin there. And we're aware that we can turn to Hashem, but we often do, yet it is hard for us to hear His answer. That's where many of us really, truly struggle. It's not that we don't call on God, it's sometimes that we have a hard time hearing back. Now, Pharaoh, he was willing to pull someone out of the jailhouse to learn the truth about his dreams. Imagine that. This is some serious desire to know the truth. The answer that he needed came not from the experts, because they failed and they disappointed him. The king was willing to listen to the lowest of his slaves, someone who needed a bath, honestly, before he would come before a king. That's how far he was willing to go. The question is, do we have that type of a humility to take advice and wisdom from people who seem so unlikely to give us any advice, from people who we may not think that are qualified to give any advice to anyone whatsoever? Do we have that kind of humility? Amazingly, Pharaoh did. Now, that's not a natural course of things, but when, God speaks, a lot of times, that is how He speaks the loudest, to these unexpected situations. So my second point is this. Answers from God often require stepping out on faith. Yes, sometimes those answers come through no experts at all, and sometimes, a lot of times, answers from God really require faith from us. And that is how we, a lot of times, know that this is God who's speaking. Experts, I turn to experts for a lot of different things, and they're great about minimizing the risk, offering some safe, conservative options to us a lot of times. They will give us some reasonable advice, and a lot of times you realize they're being protective with their reputation. They're giving me advice, but they're also looking out, making sure that they don't give me wrong advice, because that would make them look really bad and kind of undermine their expertise. So But that's not what you're looking for when you're turning to them, right? You're not looking for them to maintain their reputation. You just want to solve your problem. So the king's advisors were wise, by the way, in not trying to give him some kind of a story. They just said, we don't know. We can't interpret the dream. That was wise. And Joseph gave an interpretation to the king, and that interpretation, according to Joseph, in his own words, was not his. He said, these words are not from me. This is from God, who will see to the good of Pharaoh. Now, what's interesting to me is that interpretation of that dream. Once the meaning became clear, it challenged for things to change, how things are done in Egypt. It required action. And you see, transformation with us begins a lot of times with our hearts and minds. That's where it starts. But where really the world changes around is when we actually take actions. And my friends, actions, they require faith and they require trust. You see, Pharaoh had to trust in Joseph and in his ability to interpret the dreams. He had to lean on that the interpretation he gave him was right on, to the point that he's going to change the national economic policy of the whole country based on the dream and the fact that it was interpreted correctly. Just imagine that. How much faith and trust was placed into Joseph. And Joseph, of course, he wasn't trusting himself very much. He called out to God and he said, God gave me the right interpretation because I don't know. I'm relying on you, God. So there's a lot of faith that happens in the story. And in the end, what I want you to realize is that when the answer does come from God, if it really is from God, it will challenge us and it will ask us to take these concrete steps of faith. For some of us, these will be huge steps and leaps of faith that are necessary when we are found in this situation, when we're stuck and we're asking for God's help to resolve it. So my prayer is that we will have courage to act out our faith as God speaks to us in this way, if we only hear him.